Okay, we're going to talk about recovery methods next. Now, I did something since the last recording. I actually went out and deleted all the backups I had for Acme DC2. And then when I brought this up, I had to change the recovery method on Acme DC2. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But let's focus on Acme DC1 first. You'll notice when I highlight a DC, the details for that DC's configuration are down below. Let me just resize this a little bit. And if I change my method here, perhaps I change to a CleanOS recovery instead, you'll see that those fields are all filled in, and I've added some additional fields down below. Backup stayed the same. Server access credentials stayed the same. Additional settings had configured the domain controller as a global catalog server added. The preferred DNS server settings stayed the same. These are what we call common fields down below, and so you'll see that those change based on what you have. Now, by default, I want that checked. I probably unchecked it earlier. In CleanOS recovery, we take a new server, and then we read the backup and get the forest, domain, and DC name from the backup. And then we take that new server and we promote it using the same forest, domain, and DC name as we found in the backup. Then we tweak that newly promoted server, because it is a brand new server in a brand new forest, and we make it accept the backup that we're going to apply to it. And then we reboot into DSRM and we restore the backup from production, this Acme DC1 backup. When we reboot back into normal mode, you have a functioning domain controller for that domain. And we do that, of course, for each domain that you do CleanOS restore on. When you do that promotion, you can decide what paths you want for your DIT database, your logs, and your sysvol. You can leave them the same as what's in the backup, or if you uncheck the box here, you can use the default. System root is C Windows on most servers, so that will go into system default. Or if you wanted to, after you've unchecked the box here, you can enter whatever path names you want for those backups, as long as your target server has those locations and there's enough space to hold these files. That's where they'll be restored to. All right, so that's CleanOS recovery in a nutshell. Let's move on to bare metal recovery. Now, with bare metal recovery, you'll notice we have two restore from backups. We have the restore from bare metal backup, and we have restore from Active Directory backup. The interior of these are fairly similar, although I did have to enter credentials for where my bare metal backup is stored. These credentials were there already from earlier when I entered them. So I enter those credentials. I can also select to scan that backup and the Active Directory backup, if applicable, for malware during project verification. We'll actually do that in the start of the recovery process as well. And I also have this option to wipe all disks on the target machine. Aside from that, a bare metal recovery is very similar to a CleanOS or other recovery. If my backup for bare metal ends up being newer than my latest Active Directory backup, then I would probably want to unselect this and only restore from bare metal. That's a valid recovery method as well. But in my scenario, I know this backup is old. It's about 28 days old, and this backup was just from an hour or two ago. So I'll restore bare metal, then the server will get rebooted into DSRM, and we'll restore the latest Active Directory to it. Again, when we reboot it back into normal mode, we'll have a functioning domain controller that we can then configure. And again, all of that's automated, even the configuration part. You'll notice also I could pick a different target server if I wanted to. By default, I'm going to use whatever's in the backup as my target IP address and everything, but I can configure that. And if I'm going through a firewall, I can pick NAT settings here for that. So that's bare metal recovery. So now let's get into the other recovery methods, the ones that are not restoring from backup. The first one we'll cover is reinstall Active Directory. And you know what? I'm going to change this back to, say, CleanOS. And maybe we'll start with install Active Directory. So I'll go to DC2. Remember, I don't have a backup of DC2, but I do want to bring that domain controller back online. So here I've entered the IP address of my target server. That's a little bit new. We saw that for CleanOS recovery as well. And down below, I've picked where my paths are going to be for my install Active Directory parameters. Maybe I've entered different paths here. But other than that, I can decide whether I'm going to promote this box using media, and we use the backup, so you'll notice this is a backup from DC1. Or I could decide just to promote it over the wire. I just uncheck that box, and you'll see this change to install Active Directory versus install Active Directory from media. Obviously, restoring from media is faster. We actually copy the backup from the other domain controller, or from some other domain controller that we have a backup for in that domain, onto the DC while that DC is being promoted. And so that's done long before I can do the DC promo, because I can't really promote a new server into a forest until I've restored servers from backup. Install AD will actually wait for that to finish. But other than that, I think everything's the same. Oh, the last is that I could decide whether or not this is a read-only domain controller, and all I need to do is check that box, and it would do that. I don't have an RODC backup, so I can't really jump into that scenario from here. I could do that over the wire, could say let's not use a backup, and that would be valid. We'll leave that to install from media. We did install. Let's do reinstall so we can see that. Now, reinstall Active Directory, you notice some of the parameters disappeared. This basically force demotes the server and then re-promotes it. And again, I can use media from a backup. You can see it's using Acme DC1 again. I can do that, or I can just re-promote it over the wire. This is a method we don't see used much today because ransomware has probably taken that server out and we need to replace it. So reinstall Active Directory is not used much. Let's go to uninstall Active Directory. Again, this is a method that we don't see used much today because domain controllers are usually all gone by the point that you're recovering, so there's no reason to go force demote the server. But that's what this method does if you wanted to demote a server because you knew it was in a physical location that's compromised, or maybe you just didn't want that server in your forest anymore for whatever reason. This would go force demote that server. If I didn't have that server around, say it was corrupt and gone, I wouldn't use this method. I instead would use the last method we have, which is do not recover. In do not recover, we never reach out to the server. We never try to demote it. We never try to access it. We simply take the metadata for this DC and remove it from the directory. Now that's a great one to use if you're going to do recovery in phases, but if you are going to bring that DC back in a later phase, you'll want to check this box. And that keeps that domain controller in the project. All right, so those are the methods that you see when running forest recovery or domain recovery. There is one more method we'll see in domain recovery, which I'll cover here in a little bit. But let me just kind of set up for a forest recovery the way I would probably recover my environment across the board. I've got Aussie DC1 and Poodle DC1. I want to do a CleanOS recovery on them as well, so I selected both of them, and I'll click CleanOS. Now I need to enter target IP addresses, and I'm going to use the original target IPs. So 10.1.1.20, and then on the other server, I need 10.1.1.30. So those servers are set. On the DC2 boxes, I'm going to use install Active Directory. So I'll pick install Active Directory from the list. And again, it's going to want IP addresses, so I've got that one entered. And here I'll put in 10.1.2.30. And for my last Acme DC1, I think I'll leave that on Do Not Recover, but I will keep it in the project because I'm going to promote that as soon as my target server is ready to go. Maybe it's not ready yet. This is where I want to be for recovery. I do want to scan all my selected backups, so I'm going to select these other CleanOS methods and make sure this is checked for all of them. So now I've got that checked. For these other DCs, I do have backups for these DCs. I don't necessarily want to use those backups. So either I could go delete them from the console like I did for Acme DC2, or I could simply manually select, so I can uncheck that box and hit the select button. And here I want to use Aussie DC1. And then here I want to use Poodle DC1. Again, this all depends on how you have backups set up. Pick the most recent, that's good. Okay, good. So now I've got that all set. I think I'm ready to verify settings. So I'm going to go ahead and start my verify settings process, and I will start in the next video. We'll review this.